Okay, I have 1 o'clock on my telephone, and I think we are ready to start. We have 21 folks that have signed in. I expect a few more folks to come in, but we will start promptly as we have a very full agenda in terms of tools and tips that we are very excited to share with all of you. Um, so, with that being said, I will actually show my webcam just for a split second in case people don't know what I look like. This is me, Paco. Greetings from Ohio. Happy New Year to everybody. But it's also snowing here, so I'm gonna turn my camera off to prevent any crashing of the system and just proceed as so. Okay. Again, feel free to type in on the chat box. I have with me also Diana Toledo, our Director of Leadership Development, and she will be monitoring our chat box for questions and comments. We'll also be having a very special guest speaker, Jason Franswell, which I will introduce in a few more minutes. But again, welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us. Happy New Year. Everybody's muted just to prevent any background noise, but the chat box is on your right hand side, and you can just drop down and you can send private messages or you can send messages to everybody. Volunteering is definitely an exciting theme for me. It is globally recognized as a key activity that promotes social inclusion and social justice. So, beginning at the grassroots level and extending through societal changes, it helps bring improvements to local, national, and international efforts. So it helps build society and it helps build individuals as volunteers. They each make important contributions economically as well as socially, and it just allows us to be a more cohesive society where trust building is essential, reciprocity, and finally, of course, as we all may agree, volunteering feels good. At River Network, we are dedicated to empowering, uniting people and communities in order to protect and restore rivers and other watersheds that sustain life. So, river and watershed organizations are particularly suited to have a volunteer program, volunteer participation, because your missions are to engage with the community in caring and taking care of your local rivers. Every volunteer takes your case to heart and your message to the rest of the community, and in a sense, your mission. So that brings us even closer to achieving our collective goals. Um, this particular webinar is part of a series from our Leadership Development Institute. As you can see there in the middle of the screen, we are on the fourth webinar, and all webinars are available, the recordings upon request. You just have to send us an email. This one is being recorded right now. And as you can see, we still have two more exciting ones from the series. One next month, they're all at 1 o'clock Eastern. On Valentine's Day, we're going to have one on financial management, and we're going to wrap up with a brand new one, but very important topic of equity, diversity, and inclusion that is going to be led by Diana. Please, like all of our webinars, we have a survey at the end of the session, and it's very brief, but it really helps us improve our programs and our services. So feel free to be candid in your responses. And again, an email will be sent to you following also the webinar shortly next week with other links and materials that may be presented. And all of you, of course, are able to join this webinar as a paid member. This is one of the many benefits and resources that River Network provides. This, along with others such as our conference, there's a discount for paying members. There's also our monthly e-newsletter that you should be getting, our quarterly magazine. We are able to promote your own job openings, events, and work. So feel free to use us as a network. We have a very, very outstanding support in Carly Schmidt here, our membership associate. She's actually in the webinar too. But if you have any questions about your benefits, feel free to send her an email. Her email is right there. So that's me on the left. Not very flattering picture, but it's just because I was about to get on a whitewater rafting trip in Colorado, but it was no, that was in California actually. But I'm the leadership development manager for the Great Lakes area for River Network. There's 3 of us in this team. Diana, our director, and there's also Caroline Bott. She's in the Chesapeake area. And that's Jason. Jason, I will let you introduce yourself in a few seconds. I will remind myself to unmute you. And but myself, I have been doing this for just over 14 years, helping nonprofits think and act strategically, improving their efficiencies and effectiveness. My main interest is strengthening leaders to ensure your own organization's continuity and success. I have worked with groups in strategic planning, fundraising, engagement, board development, succession planning. My background is biochemical engineering, and I'm a marine mammal bioacoustician by training, but a grassroots organizer in my heart. I am based, like I said, out of my home office, about an hour north of Columbus, Ohio, and out here in the country, I do what I like the most, which is going on long walks with my family. And you can see there the main points of our agenda that we hope to cover. We will follow the same format we have always used in these webinars, which is an interactive type of webinar where you can post questions at any time. We will pause for questions too, and we are definitely available for follow-up, whatever you may need. And now I'll introduce my good friend and colleague, Jason Frenzel.
Thanks, Paco. Yeah, my name is Jason Frenzel. I'm the Stewardship and Volunteer Coordinator at the Huron River Watershed Council here in Ann Arbor, Michigan. We cover a small watershed for Michigan in the Metro Detroit area, but not including Detroit. I've been a volunteer manager for the last 18 years now. For 10 years, I worked in natural lands management for a natural area program with the city of Ann Arbor. And for the last nearly 8 years, I've been here at the Watershed Council. I'm also have played a leadership role in volunteer management, both locally and nationally. I was up until last month, I was the president of my National Association of Volunteer Managers. So it's an umbrella organization working to promote and support volunteer managers throughout any industry, environmental or housing or arts or healthcare or whatever. So my interest is both ecological as well as in the human resources realm. And I'll be sharing a few of the best practices later in the webinar. And if I knew that I needed to have a dress up photo, I would have sent you a cooler picture of me chainsawing in a river. But I didn't know it was that kind of presentation, Paco.
Yeah, I actually sprung it upon Jason just about 5 days ago. I said, "Hey, would you like to join our webinar?" But as you can see, my clear choice was Jason. He has a lot of experience. He's actually taught me a lot about volunteers. He does look just as handsome as that picture, even right now, and he will definitely add to this webinar. Thank you, Jason, very much for being with us.
Yes.
So just as a form of icebreaker, and that's a Russian icebreaker there on the right. I'd like for you all to familiarize with the chat box. So in the chat box, please type in. We have our first poll, or well, not the first poll. Let me ask just the first open-ended question. Please type in anything unique as it relates to volunteerism for yourself. For example, that picture on the left is another very handsome man pulling a train, a barrel train, and that's actually me. And that's actually our property. My wife has an outdoor education center, and so I am the default volunteer and trained conductor for my wife's eco center. So if people don't mind just sharing really quickly on the chat box things about you that are unique as it relates to volunteerism, just take a few seconds to do that, please. Someone raised their hand. That was Kev Stillwell. Diana, I'm not able to see the chat box. Are you?
Yes, so let me read some of these out.
Thank you.
Carly shares she's worked with hundreds of volunteers in the past. Brooke manages the Volunteer Stewardship Network for the Nature Conservancy in Illinois. Elena is a networker for other people, likes to connect expertise. Hannah shares that this year they had the highest amount of volunteers, over 1,100 ever, for their annual stream cleanup. And they removed a record-breaking nearly 36,000 pounds of marine debris, wow, from the Toledo area. In college, Wendy volunteered at a local nature center. Tova shares that they really lack a volunteer program and lack time and funding to promote that work. Some folks monitor flow in Tucson's dry arroyos and rivers. There's a lot of volunteers within us, so they understand both giving and receiving, like Kristen shares. Rana coordinates about 35 volunteers to go out 4 times a year to do water quality monitoring and is challenged by retention of these volunteers. And Jamie shares there's a lot coming in. I don't know. Tell me when to stop.
I think that's good. I appreciate it's and that we actually are capturing all this chat can then even be processed later. But I appreciate a lot of great experience. Thank you all very much.
Yeah, the number of volunteers goes up to 25,000 volunteers that folks are working with. So lots of expertise in the room.
Yeah, Steve, Jaime, Ron, thank you all. Susan. And yeah, I mean, volunteers is what makes your organizations thrive and be able to achieve so much. So I'm glad we posted this quick question. But we will just launch our first poll, Diana, if you don't mind.
Yeah, so you should see the poll in front of you. Does your organization have a formal written volunteer recruitment and training plan? So we have some votes are coming in. About half the people have voted, so let me just give it a couple of seconds here for everybody to tally their vote. Okay, we've got about 90% of folks have voted, so I'm going to give it 3 seconds, 2 seconds, 1 second, and off we go. So hopefully everybody can see the responses. Only 4% of those of you here actually have a written volunteer recruitment and training plan. 3/4 do not, and about 20% of you are not sure whether or not you do.
Okay.
Back to you, Paco.
Thank you. Thank you. And for some technological glitch, I cannot see the results, but thank you, Diana, for spelling them out, and thank you all for sharing. And don't worry, if you don't have a volunteer recruitment plan, you will know how to do one, and we will be glad to help you. And this is actually fundamental for us to be able to recruit and manage volunteers. So here's a questions. You don't have to answer in the form of a question, but there's this person. Oh, I messed up. I already have the answer there. Alexander Tocqueville, he's a French observer during the Revolutionary War, and I like his quote there of Americans regarding for themselves constantly prompt them to assist one another, inclines them willingly to sacrifice a portion of their time and property for the welfare of others. So back in 1835, it was already well known that volunteerism is strong in America. If anything tells us it is as much needed now as ever, and it is definitely a great asset that us as Americans are able to share in some of our time and give to worthwhile causes. I have here some quick stats from the Huffington Post that I read recently. About a quarter of Americans volunteer. That is about 63 million people. And they average just over 32 volunteer hours per person per year. That comes up to about 7.9 billion hours of service. And that, depending on the numbers you use, is about $184 billion. An additional 50% of Americans actually donate $25 or more to charity. And volunteering, as we all know, it is mostly strong. 34% of volunteer hours are dedicated to religious activities. Education comes in at 26%, social services 15%, health-related fields 8%, and I would probably put health together with environment as they're very, very linked. And just because I don't have a specific percentage for environment, civic duty about 5%, and sports and arts about 4%. Maybe later when Jason has an opportunity to chat, he can tell us if these numbers are also resonating with him. So let's move on. People volunteer for many, many reasons. Despite there's a technological moat in modern times, modern society, we're all stuck behind our computers all the time, preventing us from being outside, from connecting so much. We have very little extra time, especially amongst working parents, and yet people still find time to volunteer. Just think about why you volunteer, a time that you volunteered maybe for an activity. Why did you decide to do it? What were the benefits? What were your expectations? Was it a successful experience? And those same questions you can ask for other people. Why are they volunteering or not for your organization? So here's a quick list of why people mostly volunteer. But we must remember, when we ask someone to help us, we're not asking them for a favor. We're actually giving them an opportunity to participate in making a difference in the world. So I do this a lot. My wife notices it. Whenever I see a problem, I change it into an opportunity. And really volunteering, I'm not a shy person, if you know me. We are not begging people for help. We're actually extending them an opportunity to make a difference. So if you get into the mindset, I think it will be easier to ask for support. Now, who are these volunteers? The Corporation for National and Community Service is home to the most comprehensive look at volunteerism and civic life. And so we have data for United States. They've been gathering for quite a while now on rates, rankings, trends, and you can see it you can look up for your individual state, because from the attending list, we have people from all time zones, even They break it down to major cities. But you can see there how volunteerism, neighborhood engagement has been steadily increasing. Retention is at a good number, and that's an average problem that people have, like training new volunteers. There's also volunteering. People do it for one or two organizations. This is a stat from 2010 that I had. And volunteerism is highest amongst young adults, that 22% there on my fourth bullet. Well, actually, Generation X is a little bit higher currently, but the trends are for more younger people to be involved. And the silent or the greatest generation, the pre-baby boomers, they're the ones that are able to afford more hours, and it's just logical in terms of their time in their life where they have a little bit more time to donate. I made up this graph given more information about volunteerism, just to see the profile or the demographics. Not surprising, on the x-axis is the percentage of volunteers. White-collar professionals, just over 40% of them. Service sales sectors, 26%, and labor occupations have the smallest amount of volunteers. But one stat that did surprise me a little bit was here how rural and urban are very, very closely tied. People volunteer closest to their community, of course, and you would think that there's some perks of living in the city or some perks of being in the countryside in terms of relationships, in terms of opportunities, but the percentages there you see are very, very close. And actually, I thought urban would have been higher than rural, but it's not that huge of a difference. But still, these are numbers from 2011, maybe a little bit changing now. Let me advance this. So times are definitely changing. Like I said, baby boomers are getting older. More and more women are part of the workforce. Retirement ages are getting to be later in people's lives. So this, I mean, maybe not as relevant in terms of the cartoon for gas prices right now are very low, at least in Ohio, but it usually is a trend in the sense that the amount of volunteerism is changing because the professional makeup of America is also changing. Now, there's two concepts that I want to cover really fast. There's episodic volunteering and micro volunteering. If you've already heard this, just bear with us really, really fast. Episodic is just people who volunteer one time or periodically instead of ongoing or in a consistent schedule. And for example, in 1989, 40% of volunteers served 100 hours, but today it's only about 33% of people. So people are less able to dedicate many hours to volunteering. So there's an increase in episodic volunteering, and it's largely teenagers, 67.9% of them. Adults come in at 57%. And of course, we know younger people have a less consistent schedule. They turn to perform smaller actions before fully committing to a cause. And they typically prefer hands-on type of projects. Now, also some volunteers may experience a little bit of burnout. So we want to keep them coming back, as you all well know. Developing a sense of connection with your organization, satisfaction in their volunteering activity, enjoyment in every event should be in the front of your mind, so that we're able to move people from the experience of volunteering to the commitment of volunteering. By making sure that your volunteers know clearly their roles, their responsibilities, as well as the bigger picture project goals. This helps us set the expectations. It helps elevate the level of satisfaction and in turn their experience. So that's episodic volunteering. It's very easy for a episodic volunteer to get lost in the busy work of nonprofits. But it is in your best interest, again, that their satisfaction is significant by keeping them in the loop of the bigger picture of what's happening. And that way, your retention rate will be higher. You should have volunteer opportunities that are flexible. So you encourage more people to sign up. You want to resist the pressure of asking them for longer term commitments. And you should even look for ways to have roles for these episodic volunteers. Make a point of always getting feedback, because it's very easy for an episodic volunteer to walk away maybe unhappy and never come back, and you never knew why they didn't come back. So you should offer even more than your typical volunteers. For episodic volunteers, you should offer a lot of feedback opportunities. Ask them firsthand what they thought about the experience, what worked, what didn't. And this deepens your relationship, and then they feel like they had a say. And those volunteers we've asked that had a say on how the organization is run, they report feel more valued. They're likely to keep volunteering for your organization. And then their answers may help improve your volunteer program. Now, micro volunteering is similar, but it's smaller and infrequent opportunities. And again, it's all due to our busy work schedules. So micro volunteering are short tasks in a short window of time, and it's often viewed as maybe online action. So instead of asking for people to give up large chunks of time to volunteer for ongoing needs or extensive project, you create bite-sized opportunities that attract these busy people who still want to make an impact. So this results in your volunteer group ebbing and flowing, but it's at least always producing results for the larger organization. Whatever your organization's purpose may be, you can find a way to break down your mission into smaller tasks that virtually anybody can do in just a few short hours. It's also a great time to be creative, find activities that will encourage people to get involved, even if it's just for a short while. Now, you may be thinking micro volunteering is counterintuitive because of all the training that happens, but it actually has been shown to increase engagement, improve donations, lower volunteer turnover, increases website traffic, and social following. So in a sense, it provides more immediate help. So don't be afraid, and recognize it if you're having micro volunteers, if you're having episodic volunteers. Everybody is experiencing that, and just account for it, okay? So what makes a good volunteer, a great volunteer? It is not one that misses meetings, of course. It is not one that contributes little or actually gets in the way. A great volunteer is one that is engaged, informed, inspired, one that is acknowledged and is treated with care and respect. So if we have opportunities for them to step up, if we ask them their interests, their abilities, I'm a big fan of bi-directional interviews. When you're asking somebody, also feel free to respond for them questions that they may have. By creating job descriptions for various tasks, what I said about roles, responsibilities, expectations, it just increases accountability. When people have complete information that is accurate, even things that you may think are mundane, make sure to write them down. That way it prevents misunderstandings. Also, a great volunteer is one that feels safe. So make sure you take reasonable safety precautions, minimize your risks, And every organization should have waivers of liability. This is a list that I compiled from. Volunteers were asked, what are your greatest needs? What do you need as a volunteer? And they're actually ranked from highest to lowest. And you can see right there the working conditions, the camaraderie, the decision-making process, the acknowledgement of how they're valued, the recognition. These things, again, they seem natural to me, but it's important to recognize and identify specific skills, interests that your volunteers may bring to your organization. Constant communication with them, maybe an interview, a questionnaire. We talked earlier about the why people volunteer. The more you know about your volunteers, the more meaningful you can make their experience. It again builds that strong relationship between you and them. Remember, most of the time you're not paying them, so we all agree that their contributions are very valuable. So how can you make people feel worthy? This is also a good time to mention that you should be capturing this information in a records management system, a database. I will touch on databases a little bit later in the webinar. Now, a volunteer can do many, many things. And the first thing, especially for river watershed groups, we want to figure out if they're a type of inside volunteer or an outside volunteer. And of course, if they self-identify as inside volunteers, you cannot expect to just ask them to be out and doing outside things. It's just very, very, very obvious. But the roles, the tasks are endless. They can be cooks, servers, buzzers, ticket sales, researching issues for you, collect field data, monitoring water quality, phone banking, coordinating recruitment of other volunteers, clerical, legal assistance that can help you filing taxes, design, maintenance of web pages, of a database, editing your newsletter, working with media, taking pictures at events, tabling, contributing to your annual report, donating artwork, securing in-kind support. So following up with sponsors, donors, speaking opportunities. The opportunities, you know, they're endless. I will pause right now for a few questions. I also see the chat box hasn't been a little bit busy. So Diana, if you want to read any questions that may have come up.
There's just a question about whether they can get, folks will get a PDF of these slides following the session.
Yes, definitely. Probably in a few days, I will be able to send an email to everybody with a PDF of these slides, definitely. Any other questions, just feel free to type them in the chat box.
Mm-hmm. Do you have suggestions for what kinds of jobs are most appropriate for volunteers versus staff? Tova poses the question.
No, I don't. There are some volunteers that are like so amazing that you wish they were part of your staff, right? And some staff that maybe are not as engaged, that maybe they should not be staff and instead volunteers. So really the answer is it depends on the individual, in my experience.
Yeah, I wonder if Jason, would you have any thoughts on that question?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's useful to back up and think about why we value a person who's a paid staffer in a different way than why we value a person who is a volunteer. In the industry, we like to say that the only difference between a paid staff member and a volunteer is their rate of remuneration, right? The only real differential is that they get paid directly. And so I would challenge you to think about why and if in any ways you really need to consider them different, because in some, like Paco says, in some ways you'll get somebody who's more qualified than any staffer as a volunteer for some things. We just had a microplastics expert come and work with us on developing a pilot program on developing microplastics monitoring. And before that, we were reading literature, but the literature just isn't sufficient. But this guy that basically just came randomly knocking on our door had, way more knowledge than we could have gained. So I'd say it's great both ways.
Mm-hmm. A few questions have come in. Let me just read a couple of them and let's come back to the others. But either Paco or Jason. So do you have any specific examples of micro volunteer opportunities? And the other one is, do you have some examples of ways to recognize volunteers?
We will talk about recognitions and awards a little bit later in the webinar. But micro volunteering, like I said, they're just small tasks. So if you need envelope stuffing, if you need tabling, that is a very small commitment, and it contributes to the bigger picture. But it's not like, okay, every month you're going to be in the water quality monitoring team. So it's just a matter of figuring out some tasks that just need 1 or 2 hours, and that can make a big difference. And like the quick one that I saw is stuffing envelopes for your annual membership drive or something like that. That's really easy.
Another question is, what makes someone transition from just a volunteer into also becoming a donor for the organization?
Oh, good question. Good question, Hannah. And we will be talking about that. We do have a similar pyramid of engagement, kind of like your fundraising engagement pyramid. If you took the webinar 2 months ago on fundraising, I will show that a little bit. There's just a matter of opportunities. And so the more opportunities and kind of like mini tests that you have out there for your volunteer to step up to the challenge, the more responsibilities you give them, and eventually, because they're more engaged, they are giving you more, and these volunteers become some of your #1 sources of small donations.
And finally, Kirsten just shares her experience that sometimes when she's dreading a task, she reaches out to volunteers to find someone who just loves to do that exact kind of work to help out. So think about that as well as tasks that might be falling on your plate that you could get some help with as well. And finally, somebody asks if River Network has a waiver liability form that we can share, particularly for outside work, which I know we do, that we can share out perhaps as an additional resource, Paco, but I wonder if others as well might have some that they want to send our way, and we might send multiple versions of what people are using.
Yeah, I have a section at the end of the webinar on waivers, and I want to caution, because there's of course the legality of waivers. So rather, it'd be great if people want to share theirs and we can redistribute. But it is almost on a state-by-state case. So we will talk more about that. But if people want to reach out to me, then and we can find the right resources. Jason, do you have anything else you want to add?
Yeah, liability in general is a webinar unto itself. Reducing and identifying, reducing liability, adjusting risk analysis, and a subcomponent of that being liability waivers is just an undertaking unto itself. But sharing a few prime examples, and you can certainly go onto our Watershed Council's website and grab ours. It's a PDF that's hyperlinked on our website. You can just grab that if you want. So Paco, Diana, if you want to share that with the group, please feel free.
Great. I'll go ahead and post it while you guys continue.
Yeah. So again, Jason is with the Huron River Watershed Council, and this now sets up the transition for Jason to share a few slides. I'll advance them for you, Jason, if you want.
Thank you, Paco. I appreciate it. We're moving on to our second poll. So if Paco or Diana can get this going for us. It's what is your biggest volunteer program challenge? And our options, I believe, feel free to launch that if you like. Our options are going to be recruitment, which was already mentioned, retention, which was already mentioned, management, of course, and we're going to talk about that on and off throughout this, all the above, or just drop in a text box if you have something else that you'd like to mention. So please pick one of those and we'll move forward.
All right. So the votes are coming in. I'll just give it a few seconds here.
Better than voting in many states. It's going quickly and easily.
Yeah, really immediate response. All right, about half of the folks have voted, so if everybody wants to.
I'd probably mention here that one of the things that I like to talk about sometimes is sometimes we'll have recruitment be our biggest concern, and I would put forward if you're having trouble recruiting and you're spending a lot of time recruiting, one of the ways to resolve that is actually spend more time on retention, because if you retain a greater percentage of your volunteers, you don't need to recruit as many in the long run. And your knowledge base goes up, your leadership strengths go up, blah, blah, blah. And so redesigning how you're focusing your time in recruitment and retention is really important. And so that's, of course, subject to a lot of qualifications. Like here in the Ann Arbor area, we have 5 colleges and universities. So I expect my retention rate to be moderately low because we have a lot of like literal turnover in our community. So we've got a pretty mixed bag here, management being a little bit less, which is great because we're going to spend more time talking about recruitment and retention than management. So it's perfect. And then Diana, if you can pull together those other statements in a moment, I'll give you a second after the next slide. Paco, would you move forward so we can try to keep on time?
Sure.
So we're going to go through. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Paco.
I just thought, Diana, did you broadcast the results?
I did.
Okay.
Yeah.
I just can't see them, but okay, thank you.
Sorry, Paco. They were all pretty equal, with management being slightly less. So we're going to go through 4 best management practices. I'll do the first couple, and Paco will do the last couple, I believe. So we want to think about how our volunteer recruitment is building relationships. Obviously, one of the things I'd like you to think about during our entire talk here is when you go to volunteer or you have worked very closely with a volunteer, think about what their motivation is for coming in the door and what their motivation is for returning. Usually those 2 answers are very different. And so how we bring people up this ladder of engagement, if you will, is very important, and being critical about your program management and program delivery so that you allow opportunity for your volunteers to gain additional direct access or involvement either with your program staff, with the program itself, with your leadership, or in many cases with other volunteers, playing into that sort of personal interest and networking component that Paco was talking about earlier. So allowing people to again go up this ladder of engagement is very, very helpful. One of the key components here is volunteers are only going to most of the time come back to you if they know what the offer is. So you need to keep allowing opportunities to happen. So it could be the same opportunity, or it could be, and we'll be talking about this a little bit later, cross-pollinating other opportunities within your organization or deepening responsibility as this graph shows us. Paco, you could move forward, please. As Paco noted, we talked last session about the pyramid of engagement for donors. We can think about the engagement for volunteers very similarly. Here at the Watershed Council, we blend the idea of contributors, so donors and volunteers as a large unit of individuals, and we subdivide that for all sorts of reasons. But all of these people are contributing to our organization and the mission of our organizations. And so identifying how volunteers who just first come in the door can become more and more engaged and give more of their time if and when they see the interest and they have the time. We don't have control over their priorities, but we certainly do have control over how often they hear from us and ensuring that they remember that our priorities are also their priorities. And so by reminding them that we have common ground, we're more likely to touch on their value set and bring them back more often. Ways to make sure that we offer them ways to come back is we can have ongoing training, either sometimes mandatory training for quality assurance plans, or having fun training about something that might be interesting or a hot topic in the community. So just hearing from the organization and knowing that the organization is a leader related to, again, the mission that we have that's overlapping between the organization and the volunteers. And then having lots of different types of activities. When I first started here at the Watershed Council, we had two main volunteer programs, our benthic macroinvertebrate study and our chemistry monitoring program. And one was very episodic, 3 times a year, and the other was a pretty high level of commitment every week, all summer long, for 2 to 4 hours. That doesn't fit most individuals, as Paco was mentioning about micro-volunteering and episodic volunteering. And so one of the things that we did for the first few years that I was here is identify and create more what I called gateway volunteer opportunities, so ways that people could get involved, just here and there throughout the summer and throughout the growing year. That has led to an increase in the number of people through the door and the number of people that come back to us throughout the year. Paco, would you move forward again, please? So a few ideas for you to cogitate on when you are evaluating how your volunteers come to you and how they interact and how they re-engage with you when and if they are ready. Ideally, you painted the situation that is interesting to them to come in the door, and then their first experience is really positive, and which gets to something else that Paco said earlier. When we have micro-volunteers or episodic volunteers, we don't always have the ability to interact with every single one of them, making sure that organizationally and programmatically our events or the volunteer opportunity is run in a really good way that meets their interests and motivations, and it feels useful and good to the volunteers. You don't necessarily need to create the positive one-on-one interaction because they know that you're busy, yet they have had a very upstanding and engaging experience. Thereby, they believe in your organization and therefore are more likely to come back. And then on the slide, we start to look at some evaluation of how successful we are at keeping people involved and how often they're coming back and how often people are going up that pyramid of engagement. And the last question here, it also is important to think about how they move between programs. If you have multiple different volunteer engagement opportunities, if you're cross-pollinating people, that means you're keeping them longer. Even if they ditch one of their favorite volunteer projects for another one, that's okay. They're still relating to the mission, perhaps something changed personally, or they want to learn and grow in a different way. One of the things that I want you to think about regarding those last questions is how do you structurally ask those questions of your staff, your program managers? When do you ask those questions? And here we go on to leadership of our volunteers. So looking for people who move up the ranks from volunteer to a higher engagement. I like to sort of call these people mid-level manager volunteers. The idea of having program delivery or people who assist in program delivery for you drastically increases your organizational capacity. And so having people that can do that is very, very helpful. And so when you're trying to identify those individuals, it can be very hard because you might not have time to have one-on-one conversations with everybody that comes through the door. you're certainly not going to, not going to get everybody's backstory, but having a database that can collect some of that information, so you can some of their background information, so that you can review that when you need to, making sure that when somebody shows up a second or a third time, that somebody in the organization has the capacity to identify them and reach out to them. When I worked for the city of Ann Arbor, on our Monday morning meetings, we would talk about, okay, who's come back? Have you identified anybody at this weekend's volunteer events who showed any format of leadership or over interest? Are they really, really engaged in one way or another? And that informal conversation between the staff served as a method to identify up and coming leaders, that then one of us would identify the closest contact person and then have them go out and reach out to them. Or next time Joe shows up, make sure you ask Joe if he or she wants to get involved in X, Y, or Z method. It's really important to recognize that you're rarely going to have somebody just step up and say, hey, I want to be an advanced volunteer. I want to take a leadership role, because those roles aren't necessarily apparent from the outside. And in my experience, you don't want to overly recruit for those mid-level management or positions that have a lot of authority, because sometimes you'll get the wrong volunteers. So recruiting them from your existing volunteer corps is a really, really ripe location to bring in or to advance people to more responsibility. Make sure that you, when you're talking to those individuals, make sure you're identifying leadership strengths, people who can commit more time, people who have some ability to utilize or work with greater responsibility. And that could be their past history or something that, a twinkle in their eyes that you see. Another way is to identify people who are looking for additional leadership skills. So oftentimes when you're working with school age folks, undergraduates, or people who are looking to change their careers. So again, with this slide, as with the last one, identifying a structural time when you're going to ask these questions, look for them either at like a quarterly review process or an annual review for your program, a debrief from an event. That's really key, or else I have found at least that's one of the things that really easily falls off of the itinerary. Paco, would you move forward for us, please? One of the things to think about is, the volunteer all of our volunteers have very, very busy lives. They have a lot of priorities. And so making sure that the offerings that we have and the experience and interaction with us meets them where they're at and plays to their interests and strengths as much as possible. Don't do mission creep, but within your program delivery, how can you make the volunteer experience about them? How can you tailor things to meet them? One of the greatest ways to do that is to make sure that people feel appreciated. I like to think about the structure of making sure that volunteer appreciation is specific, timely, and has the appropriate level of appreciation. So specific is, thank you for your work today at our river cleanup. It was really great that you were able to help teach some young kid how to paddle a little bit better, or that you stepped in when you saw something that was about to go wrong. Being specific is really important in appreciation. We've all experienced this, but I can't mention it enough, because sometimes we get so busy that we don't give real meaningful appreciation. So specific, timely. I like to, when we have big benthic macroinvertebrate days, we'll have 150 volunteers come out. We say thanks to everybody that comes in the door. We also send an email with an evaluation and a request to become a member. And that email is queued up with all of the potential volunteers already in the BCC box. And it's, as soon as all the volunteers are out in the field and doing their work, I hit send on that email. So when they get home, in the afternoon, they have that thank you sitting in their email box. So it's the first thing that they see after they work with us, which also has helped to increase our membership conversion from volunteers. And then the appropriate level of thanks. You want to, if somebody comes out for a 1 hour or 2 hour event, you don't really need to give them anything except for a connection to your mission. But if they come back a couple times, you might want to give them some tchotchkes or whatever's appropriate for you guys. Whenever anybody volunteers with us multiple times, we give them a t-shirt and a hat. We offer it. Sometimes they ask. It's just always present there. Paco, would you like to move on again for us, please? So now we're going to move on to some more about recruitment. Just like for those of us who make a development plan for recruiting donors or make a publicity plan for getting education out to our community members or getting people to show up at events, we also want to create a recruitment plan for each of our volunteer projects. It's really important to recognize and connect our recruitment plan to our strategic plan. So you see the 4 boxes on the bottom here. If those things are connected directly, you have a lot easier time making sure that the volunteer can see, or when you explain to them that their small task for 1 hour or a day is connected to the mission of the organization. They trust that we will do that, but making it obvious is very important. So thinking through why you're doing the tasks you're doing, how you get to your recruitment plan, and where that falls within your strategic planning and annual work plan is really important. This keeps us focused throughout the year on each of our projects. Our staff has gone through a process of sort of making this linear connection for all of our projects, and now 5 or 6 years after we started that process, we moved from our staff saying, I don't really know why I do this, or I think, I intuitively get why it's important to the mission. Like if that's the staff's attitude, you can bet that the volunteers feel that at some level. And at this point, after 5 or 6 years, pretty much all of our tasks are directly lined up, and our staff is very comfortable making the linear connection from our mission to our strategic plan through to their yearly and daily tasks, and therefore whatever they're delegating to volunteers. Make sure that your goals within this project and analysis are SMART, the specific, measurable, attainable, and relevant, as well as time-based. So SMART goals are really important because that helps you deliver programming to volunteers in a way that makes sense. And I'll talk about that in just a second related to volunteer job descriptions. I think, make sure that your volunteer recruitment plan is developed by anybody in the program who's running the program, so that you have buy-in across, and it might be your program staff, it might be some volunteers, it may be having your executive director or your board review that plan, depending on what the culture of your organization is. But that inclusive nature of planning can be very helpful, especially when, as one of our listeners noted, we get into something that we don't have the capacity to do or we're not interested in doing. Being able to get somebody to help us out if they've been involved in the process of creating it, that can be very, very helpful. Paco, would you move forward again, please? So now we move on to, are you ready for volunteers? It's really, really important that we have a task list, or better yet, a job description for each of our projects. A task list if it's a very simple project like like helping out on a benthic macroinvertebrate event or a chemistry monitoring event. But if it's more involved, like being the leader of a team, you want a job description. Making sure that you have all of the space, equipment, all that stuff readily at hand and available. If you don't have that equipment, you shouldn't be inviting volunteers, obviously, into doing the task. But if you don't have the equipment, you can also ask the volunteers or your donors to either help you purchase them. In our case, we have a lot of equipment, but it's not on site, so we ask our volunteers to come and help move our equipment for us. before large events, but we have the space and the equipment readily available. You want to make sure that you have a budget associated with your program, as well as a volunteer coordinator. It is true that volunteers do not cost dollars, but it does not mean that volunteer programs are free. It takes time to administer programming. It takes time to oversee staff, including volunteer staff. And so making sure that you have both the personnel to oversee them as well as the budget to give snacks and to give appreciation, as well as potentially paying that volunteer coordinator is very important. Paco, would you move forward, please? Oh, and the last point on that one was making sure you have a database, because you really want to be able to connect with your volunteers again. So just some recruitment tips here. Paco gave me this, I had never heard of this, the 5 W's and 1 H. So when, where, what, who, and why, as well as how. I really like this, this method of thinking of something. So we're talking about at any given task or volunteer job, what is the task or job? Who do we need to complete the task? So what sort of capacity do they have? Where is the task to be done? So geographic location or resources if it's computer-based task. When does the task need to be completed? And ideally that would be a time frame. So start and stop time frame. Why is the task or the job important to our mission? Again, connecting that for the volunteers. And how will the volunteer be able to complete the task? These are the basic components of creating a job description, basically. And so thinking these through as you're developing a task or a job is really important. And they're the precursor to actually recruiting volunteers. Once you can answer those questions, you can start the recruitment process and then lead into interviewing and onboarding. It's really important is to ask the volunteer all of these specific components of the job description or the task, making sure that the recruitment or your interview delineates really specifically, are you available on Saturdays? Are you available to lift this much weight? Are you available to come to our offices or this location, or do you have transportation? So that can all be built into a recruitment language pretty readily. Being very clear about those subcomponents of the task and the job are really important. I like to remind people it's not very helpful to overly state or understate what the task is. You want to be very clear and genuine. One of my favorite examples is when somebody says, oh, we could really use your help. Anybody could do it. Could you come and help? And like, when I hear anybody can do it, it's like, well, I have a lot of very good strengths that I could utilize with a lot of organizations. If anybody could do this task, why should I be the one to do it? And so it sounds like a diminishing of the responsibility and the project. Similarly, making the project too complicated makes things seem daunting to new volunteers or volunteers who are thinking on taking on more responsibilities. Make sure to explain what the benefits of participation is. Lots of people want to learn new skills, or in some cases share their skill sets. Making sure that they know that they're going to get some sort of publicity out of it, or just free food is really important. So getting something, just because they're not being paid doesn't mean they don't get something out of the experience of volunteering, and being very clear about what that is and is not is important. Of course, being enthusiastic is really important in this process, as well as the opportunity to learn that you're going to get no as an answer on a pretty regular basis. Paco, would you move forward again, please?
Just one thing. Remember, folks, that also sometimes people will say no, so don't take it personally.
Yep, exactly. Thank you, Paco. So here we move on to recruitment channels. one of the things, again, going back to your own volunteering or the volunteers that you've interacted with, is how did you hear about volunteering that you got involved in, or what is working for you? I've seen some stats that over 80% of volunteers who engage new with a project do so because they heard word of mouth. We go to our friends and families for recommendations for all sorts of things, right? And hearing a positive accounting of interacting with an organization is very compelling if the motivation meets the mission of the organization. So having people have a really good experience is great. You can also ask them to share. People that have a good experience with you are likely to be interested in sharing their experience with the people that they care about. Maybe they already are, but being overt about requesting them to share events on social media, or just bring their family members out to events, or grab a buddy to come out, that can be really fruitful and can be a really, really good recruitment technique. Obviously, we have community or organizations that we can bring in, schools, service clubs. Here, like I said, we have a bunch of universities, so we have a lot of sororities, fraternities, both scholastic and social, to get involved. We have a lot of Rotary, Kiwanis, the Eagles Club, all those sorts of things to get people out. Similarly, we have corporate volunteer organizations. If you're in a medium or large sized city, a lot of corporations, especially on the East and West Coast, it's a little bit slower here in the Midwest, but lots of corporations have volunteerism that you can try to capitalize on. There are lots of websites that you can post volunteer opportunities to, Volunteer Match, Idealists, LinkedIn, things like that. I actually have a list of like 50 different websites that I post all of our volunteer events on. And so I make sure to set aside a time to do that recruitment. Actually, a lot of people, Paco and I were talking about this, and he's like, I really like to do this sort of stuff in the winter, which is a great down season for most of us. I actually do all of my recruitment posting in the summer because I have a bunch of interns. And so I have them do the work, because it leaves 60 hours worth of labor to get all those posted up. And so making sure that you have a dedicated time to do recruitment is important. Paco, would you move forward one more for me, please? Cool, thank you. And so the last component that I wanted to touch on was the role of volunteer manager. Obviously, this is sort of my bailiwick. Being on the national board for my association, this is some a stumping block for me. And so it's really important to dedicate a person, either part-time or full-time, ideally depending on the size of your organization. Can be paid, it can be volunteer, but somebody who's going to make sure that these components of recruitment and retention are going on, and that you're meeting the best letter of the law and HR responsibilities. It's a job unto itself, and making sure that you have somebody at your organization that can focus on this is really, really helpful in upping your game. So when I first came to the Watershed Council, everybody worked with volunteers, but nobody had this position. I was the first person that we had brought on to do this, and I did some serious reorganization, and our retention rates and our cross-pollination rates are just way, way higher than they used to be. Number of advanced volunteers who are leading programs is through the roof. I oversee 10 different programs, all of which who have a volunteer who runs them. And so your program size and your scope of work can also drastically go up by having the right volunteer coordinator on hand. And I'd say that it's really important, aside from sort of these structural elements that you want to have your volunteer manager work on, you have to have somebody that's very obviously very detail oriented and has the disposition to work with a wide array of different types of people. It's like herding cats, but it's important that you grab somebody or have somebody on board that does this, that likes doing that kind of work. So I think that's all I had for my section, and we move on to questions.
Yeah, definitely the personality of the volunteer coordinator is very, very important, and Thank you, Jason. We'll let people type in a few questions, but in the interest of time, I'm gonna jump right to the next section so that we are out of here on time, and especially because I'm going to be on the road and I'm going to be meeting with Jason in a conference tomorrow that he's teaching on volunteers, right? So,
Oh,
uh,
super, yeah.
so just feel free to type any questions you have. Those T-shirts are not available, but we will probably should make them available. The best practice number 3 is training. Um, Once you've recruited your volunteers, now you need to turn your attention to engaging or managing them and retaining them. So it's important to create a culture that welcomes volunteers. Every volunteer should receive an orientation. Jason already mentioned that. Um, to have a formal orientation process, receive introductions, know which opportunities are available, clarify questions beforehand, of course. Um, the orientation should definitely include elements like why the organization exists, what the specific work you're doing, how it ties to the bigger picture, what progress has been done. This knowledge again brings a sense of purpose to the volunteer tasks, allows them to see how their work fits into the overall mission of your organization. And we sometimes recommend, I've seen organizations have a volunteer handbook having general information about the organization, mission, program, policies, procedures, paperwork like contact information, emergency contact information, questionnaires to determine interests and skills, descriptions of opportunities, estimated time commitments, skills, physical requirements. All those things are very, very good to capture. And just in the also in the interest of disclaimer, the 5 W's and 1 H, that was from a colleague. Caroline Bott actually gave me that slide. So yeah, it is very, very, very useful to explain to folks the bigger picture. Now, as you're training and orienting, name badges, it's a very, very silly trick, but it allows staff to be very familiarized with volunteers. So everybody learns their names, have name badges for you, have name badges for them. Um, when you're figuring out special trainings or demonstrations of equipment, tools, this is part of the training support that they will be using. Um, think about pairing up volunteers with like new volunteers with more experienced volunteers. Design the training according to the complexity of the task. Now you can, like Jason said, you can have the whole gamut of kind of training, from formal to informal, from shadowing staff to again pairing with experienced volunteers. Um, do allow leeway for mistakes or questions that are maybe basic. Um, Volunteers, each of them bring their own style. And so maybe there's even other ways that you may learn of doing things differently. Um, uh, Again, look at their interests, look at their needs. And maybe from these volunteers, you'll have the next volunteer coordinator. Uh, Provide professional development opportunities when or where possible, and that way it grows your volunteer base into more leadership positions. Structure your programs. Again, have them identified with a direct supervisor. Um, have constant communication with these volunteers through your tasks, your deadlines, the instructions. Have checkpoints so they don't feel like you're micromanaging them, but you still are giving them feedback, and solicit feedback. Ask your volunteers what worked well, what suggestions they may have for the process, areas of improvement. Um, if a volunteer has an exit interview, they may have some very key information from their perspective that you hadn't thought about. So it's also important to start managing any potential conflicts or grievances that may come up from personality differences or from, again, misunderstanding. We'll talk about that a little bit further. But there may be some difficult personalities you're dealing with, especially as you're dealing with bigger and bigger numbers. At the beginning, people had mentioned volunteers in the larger numbers. So that starts to happen, not so much in small organizations that only have a handful or two handfuls of volunteers. Volunteer recognitions. We have talked about it. The number one rule in fundraising is the same one as in volunteers: is say thank you, reward your volunteer efforts, a personal note, listing folks' names on your newsletter, a small token, swag that also helps promote your own organization. Those go a long ways. Remember, your board of directors are also volunteers, so they need to be thanked in many appropriate ways throughout the year. Now, a reward is something you give to someone for service or attainment of a project. An award is more like a special recognition that only a few people receive. So rewards and awards are a little bit different, but pay attention to giving both. Some may be at regular events, other may be at your annual event, even promoting volunteer events to celebrate, to socialize informally. Again, building that team. As you're evaluating your programs, figure out if costs are different than what you expected, benefits, and maybe whether the training needs to occur at a different time, or maybe it should be done in a different way. You're always fine-tuning. That's why that bullet for evaluation is there. Keeping your records. We have said contact information, notes of what the volunteer likes or dislikes, notes on how they're responding to specific tasks. They will help you decide which tasks you give them, new ones, or if they are ready for a new leadership position. All of these things are critical. You may notice we talking about not so much managing, but more like engaging your volunteers. This is a paradigm shift that nonprofits are really working on. Instead of you're cultivating, you're networking your volunteers. You're not just recruiting them. By having a volunteer coordinator dedicating who is crafting a recruitment plan, you have clear roles, follow through. You are doing another acronym, the 5 R's, right? Recognizing their efforts, respecting their time, giving them roles, showing them a relationship with things, allowing times for rewards and results. Those are my 5 R's: recognize, respect, role, relationship, reward, and results. Maybe that's 6 actually. Yeah, six R's. But again, you think about ways you're providing support. You're not just supervising them. You're not doing performance reviews. You're measuring progress. So it's just a different mindset that makes your programs more sustainable and really boosts your retainment and people coming back to your programs. So really quickly about waivers. They are a common part of our culture. It's hard to find a parking lot ticket or even a cup of coffee without messaging releasing companies from liability. Do they really work? I mean, if a volunteer is somehow injured while engaged in your organization's activity, a waiver of liability does not simply erase your problems. It actually is determined the degree of which your actions may have been negligent. So whether or not you have first obtained a waiver of liability, the most important consideration is whether you took all reasonable safety precautions and sought to minimize the risk as much as possible. So if you knowingly send your volunteers out to a river during a flood stage, in a leaky boat, or without PFDs, you still have a liability problem. Waiver of liability will help you in circumstances when there's an injured volunteer. So it's most likely the injured volunteer's insurance company that will base their claims of negligence on whoever failed to warn their volunteers of the dangers inherent to the river environment. So the waiver is effective as an acknowledgement that the volunteer knows that the rivers are dangerous, they accept the risks, and that no matter how careful you are, there's still going to be some injuries. It's primarily like an exercise in diplomacy. As you attempt to ensure your volunteers are properly informed in a way that is accurate and sensitive. So it's a good idea when crafting your liability waivers to work maybe with a pro bono attorney whenever possible. Now there, I'm quoting the Federal Volunteer Protection Act of '97. It promotes volunteerism by limiting and in many cases completely eliminating a volunteer's risk of tort or civil wrongdoing when acting for nonprofits or government entities. This is a mouthful, so basically people who volunteer to assist nonprofits run the risks at their own actions, and even though they're well-intentioned, they may be subject to some harm. Like I said before, states have statutory protections. So the Federal Volunteer Protection Act preempts state laws that are less protective, but you should double check with what is in your specific state. And yeah, I mean, you don't want to scare your volunteers of the activities they're about to do, but you definitely don't want to be sued either. So consider their exposure to risks, treat them as like employees, like we said. Accordingly, do background checks, have special trainings, have certification, have a risk management procedure, a program. So have all these safety things there so that when insurance companies are looking into a claim, they have a harder time finding weaknesses in your program. But also there's special discounts for nonprofits, so you just should be aware of all of that. Now, if there's issues, like I said, there's different personalities, different abilities, different talents. You should not ignore poor performance from volunteers. Otherwise, it's a snowball effect. You should understand what the situation is. You need to maybe pull someone aside, get their perspective. If do this before other individuals are there, set aside time. Maybe it's a character issue. Maybe this image is from NOAA facilitator training or how to deal with disruptive behaviors. It's a good tool to have in your toolbox, and I have some links that I will share later. Maybe it's a chemistry issue. Maybe he or she are not good and competent, or maybe it's just not the right fit. Define what the problem is, separate that problem person, talk about what specifically is not happening correctly. Abstain from saying he or she are the problem. Don't jump straight into that. That's never a winning situation. And own up to things. I do this every day in my marriage. It's almost never 100% about them. Find out what you've done that was wrong. Be right up front with it. Sometimes you'll realize it's you. It's not them. Put your egos aside. Assume best intentions. So it may be a legitimate reason why a volunteer may be behaving the way they are or not. And finally, of course, find the solutions. Suggest changes that are good for the individual, good for the organization. Team them up with somebody else. Give them a different role. These are just, again, straightforward. We want to avoid volunteer burnout. There's often also a cycle with volunteers. There's you want to move them up the leadership roles. Their energy levels may change, may wane. Rotate them in terms of responsibilities. Help them keep everybody involved. Avoid them feeling left out or being frustrated. Sometimes enthusiasm declines or things get slower in certain months. A volunteer, some signs of volunteer burnout may be when they're absent, when they're late, or quitting altogether, of course. Don't take advantage. Great volunteers don't need more work. So you don't reward good volunteers with giving them more work. You should just acknowledge, again, there, their contribution. And the last best practice we want to touch on is this database, a way to record all of this information about your volunteers, their skills, their interests, the job they performed, their expectations. It doesn't have to be elaborate. There's easy ways to capture it. Their preferences, maybe they hate phone calls, maybe they prefer to work outside, maybe they work more in the afternoons, or maybe some personal details they shared with you. If they agree to make phone calls but they never did, you also should keep track of that. There's online databases for volunteers. There's Volunteer Match, there's Idealist, there's others that we will post. The next slide I will show, Wild Apricot has a review of the top 10 free volunteer management software. There's also a great webpage called TechSoup. Have a volunteer tracking mechanism. I don't have a copy of this, but we can create it, and it's easy, just where you capture some of their information. I want to thank Jason. This bottom blue number there is the actual value of volunteer time. The current one, I had the number for, I think, 2016, and $24.69 an hour. This helps you, of course, when you're doing matching to your grants. So don't leave money on the table. Keep track of this. Value your working hours. So these are some resources that I touched on briefly. Again, you will be receiving both the PowerPoint and the recording. And right before we go, we still have a few more minutes. Just remember, our next webinar, Nonprofit Financial Management, will be at 1 o'clock Eastern next month on Valentine's Day. You will be getting an evaluation survey. If not, we can also post it maybe on the chat box. Diana, I don't know if we have it handy. But the last thing is definitely our River Rally is coming to Ohio, June 21st to the 23rd. The 50th anniversary of the Cuyahoga Catching on Fire. To those that hopefully will be able to be here in my home state. Registration is about to open in a few weeks, so keep track of that. And we want to close in with this quote from Kofi Annan, a Nobel Peace Prize laureate, the former Secretary of the General United Nations. In December 2010, in honor of the European Year of Volunteering, he said this. And this quote, of course, captures the enormity of the value of volunteerism. It's not just on our own organizations, like I said, it's at a local level, and at international level too. Here's our contact information. And I always like to use slides. Those are my kids that probably weren't volunteering there. They actually were caught playing in the rain. But it's always who we're doing it for. So I appreciate everybody's time. Definitely, Diana. Thank you, Jason. Very, very glad that we were able to connect. And I'll stay on for a few more minutes if anybody wants to put anything in the chat box. But that's it for me. Jason, do you have anything else?
No, I'm happy to stick around and answer a few questions. So
I'm not seeing, this is Diana, I'm not seeing just some thank yous coming in, no questions though. So thank you for everybody for joining us.
Okay. We'll give it.
I think we can just sign off.
Yeah, we'll give it just one more minute. And thank you again. Again, all this information will be available to you. And good luck with your volunteer programs.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Jason.
Oh, of course, sir.
See you in a few hours.
Absolutely. When are you going to go to Lansing?